Procopius of Caesarea, took it upon himself to record the great wars fought under Emperor Justinian, ruler of the Romans. These were the wars against the barbarians in both the East and the West. He set down the story of each conflict separately, so that the passing of time would not erase such extraordinary deeds from memory. Without a record, he feared, they might be lost to oblivion forever. He believed that preserving these events would not only honor the past, but also serve the present and even guide future generations. After all, those who prepare for war or any great struggle can learn much from history. A narrative of similar trials shows how earlier men fared, what choices they made, and what outcomes they achieved. For the wise, such knowledge can hint at the likely results of present struggles. Procopius was confident that he was the right man for this task. Not only was he educated and skilled, but fortune placed him at the very heart of events. As advisor to the great general Belisarius, he witnessed most of what he would later record, and he held firmly to one principle. Rhetoric may use cleverness. Poetry may rely on imagination, but history must be faithful to truth. For that reason, he did not conceal failures, even those of his closest companions. He wrote with honesty, whether the actions were noble or shameful. He also made a bold claim that no deeds in history surpassed those performed in Justinian's wars if one judges by truth rather than by blind reverence for antiquity. These wars, he argued, contain feats greater than any we know from the past. Yet some readers, dazzled by the glamour of ancient times, refuse to see the worth of the present. They heap lofty titles upon the soldiers of old, calling them shield men or hand-to-hand fighters, while dismissing modern troops with the simple word bowmen. But Procopius challenged this view. The archers of Homeric days, Aram and Dead, Wuas, were lightly armed. They carried no shield, no spear, no armor. They fought on foot, hiding behind a comrade's shield or crouching behind a tombstone. They could neither chase down a fleeing enemy nor hold their ground in open battle. Worse still, their archery was weak. They pulled the bowstring only to the chest, so their arrows were feeble and often harmless. By contrast, the bowmen of Procopius' own time were formidable. They rode into battle wearing armor and greaves that reached to the knee. At their sides hung both sword and arrows. Some even carried spears. A small shield protected their face and neck. These men were expert horsemen, firing in full gallop to either side, striking enemies whether in flight or pursuit. They drew the bowstring back to the ear, launching arrows with such force that neither shield nor breastplate could stop them. Yet despite such advances, many people still clung to the old belief that only ancient warriors deserved admiration. Procopius rejected this nostalgia. In his view, the greatest and most remarkable deeds of all were those performed in the wars of his own age. And so, he began his history, setting the stage by recounting the struggles between the Romans and the Medes, their victories and their defeats, and preparing his readers for the epic story to come. When Emperor Arcadius lay on his deathbed in Byzantium, he faced a grave dilemma. His only son, Theodosius, was still an infant, not yet weaned. Arcadius feared for both the boy and the empire. If he appointed a co-ruler, that man might become a rival, cloaked in imperial power, and destroy his son. But if he left the empire solely in the hands of a helpless child, opportunists would surely rise. They could overthrow young Theodosius with ease, and without a strong guardian in Byzantium, the throne would fall. Arcadius could not rely on his brother Honorius in Italy, who was already overwhelmed by troubles there. And to the east, the Medes threatened, ready to crush the Romans if weakness showed. For once, Arcadius, who was not known for wisdom, conceived a brilliant plan. Whether inspired by his advisors or by divine insight, he devised a safeguard for both his son and the empire. In his will, he named Theodosius as emperor, but placed him under the guardianship of Isdagurts, king of Persia. He pleaded with the Persian monarch to use all his strength and wisdom to protect the boy and the Roman realm. Arcadius died soon after, but his plan succeeded. His deeds, already famed for his nobility, honored the charge. He chose loyalty over ambition, maintaining a deep peace with Rome and shielding the empire for young Theodosius. He even sent a letter to the Roman Senate, accepting the role of guardian and warning he would wage war against anyone who conspired against the boy emperor. 4 years later, Theodosius had come of age. Istigerdes had died, and his successor Valens marched a great Persian army into Roman lands. Yet in the end, no battle was fought, and no city was lost. Here is how it happened. Anatolius, the Roman general of the East, had been sent alone as ambassador to meet the Persians. When he approached the enemy host, Edismont had walked forward on foot and presented himself before Valens. The Persian king, astonished, asked who this man could be. When told it was the Roman general, he was so struck by the respect and courage of the gesture that he immediately turned his horse around and withdrew. The entire Persian army followed him. Back in his own territory, Valens received Anatolius warmly. He granted peace on the terms the Romans requested, with only one condition. Neither side would build new fortifications near their shared frontier. With the treaty secured, both rulers returned to governing their empires in peace. Not long after, the Persian king Perussus found himself at war again, this time over borders with a formidable neighbor, the Ephalite Huns, better known as the White Huns. He gathered a great army and marched north to confront them. Now, these White Huns were not like the other Hun tribes the world knew. Though they carried the same name, they lived far from the Huns of Attila's fame. Their homeland stretched directly north of Persia. Their capital city, called Gorgo, stood on the Persian frontier itself, a flashpoint for constant disputes over territory. Unlike the wandering hordes of the steppe, the Ephalite were settled. They had tilled their land for generations, and because of that, they rarely troubled Roman soil unless fighting alongside Persian allies. They were unique among the Huns, in more ways than one. Their skin was pale, their features striking, not harsh. Their lives were orderly, even refined. Unlike the rough existence of their nomadic cousins, they lived under a single king and a lawful system. Justice and fairness mattered to them, as much as to Romans or Persians. Their society also held curious traditions. Wealthy men often surrounded themselves with companions, 20, sometimes more. These friends shared in their host's wealth, feasting at his table and binding their lives to his. And when that wealthy man died, those companions were not released. Instead, they were buried alive with him, following their leader into the grave. King Peroses marched confidently against the White Huns. At his side rode an ambassador from the Roman Emperor Zeno, a man named Eusebius. The Huns, however, were playing a dangerous game. They pretended to be terrified, scattering as if in retreat. Their flight led deep into a valley surrounded by steep mountains and hidden by thick forests. To the Persian eye, it looked like an open road stretching far ahead, but in truth, it was a trap. The path ended abruptly in a dead end, sealed off by the mountains themselves. Peroses didn't see the danger. He pushed forward recklessly, forgetting he was in enemy territory. A small band of Huns kept fleeing ahead of him, while the main force circled around unseen, positioning themselves behind the Persians. Step by step, the Persians marched deeper into the snare. Some of Peros's men, the Medes, began to suspect the truth. Fearful of their king's temper, they dared not warn him directly. Instead, they begged Eusebius, the ambassador, to speak. And so he did not with blunt words, but with a fable. He told of a lion who came upon a goat, tied and bleating atop a small mound. The lion lunged, hungry for an easy kill, but he fell into a deep trench, one built with a narrow, circular path that had no exit. The goat had been bait, set there to lure him to his doom. The story struck Peroses. Fear crept in. Was he, like the lion, rushing blindly into ruin? He halted his advance. By now, the Huns no longer bothered to hide. They closed the entrance to the valley, cutting off retreat. The Persians were trapped, and all hope seemed lost. Then came the message. The king of the Ephalite sent envoys to Peroses. They scolded him for his foolish arrogance, for leading both himself and his army into destruction. And yet, the Huns would show mercy. They would let the Persians go if Berosus bowed before the Hun king as his master, swore the sacred Persian oaths, and promised never again to make war on them. Berosus was shaken. He called for his magi, his priests, and asked for counsel. The magi answered carefully. As for the oath, they said, he could decide for himself. But as for bowing, there might be a way to save face. After all, Persians already knelt each morning before the rising sun. If Berosus timed it right, he could bow at dawn, turning eastward, so that to his people it looked like a daily ritual, not submission, and so it was done. Berosus made his pledges. At dawn, he bowed, the Hun king watching, and with that the Persians were spared. The king and his army returned home, not victorious, but alive. Not long after swearing an oath of peace, the Persian king Persius broke his word. Burning with anger, he sought revenge against the Huns for an insult he could not forgive. He summoned warriors from across Persia and its allies, raising a vast army. Only one son, a youth named Gabades, was left behind. The rest, nearly 30 princesses, took with him into battle. The Huns, or Ephthalate, soon learned of the invasion. They were outraged, not only by Berosus' betrayal, but also by what they saw as their own king's failure. They accused him of abandoning them to the Persians. But their king, Laphian, asked, "Tell me, what have I abandoned? Your land? Your weapons? Your possessions?" His people replied bitterly, "No. You abandoned the one thing on which all else depended, the chance to act." The Huns wanted to march immediately, but their king restrained them. He pointed out that the Persians had not yet crossed into their territory. Instead, he prepared a trap. On the wide plain where the Persians would soon arrive, he ordered a massive trench dug. Wide and deep, only a narrow strip was left intactus, enough for 10 horses to pass abreast. Over the rest, reeds and earth were laid, disguising the pit beneath. When the time came, the king gave his soldiers careful instructions. Retreat in a narrow column, cross slowly over the narrow path, and avoid the concealed ditch. Then, as a final insult, he hung from his royal banner the very salt over which Berosus had once sworn his broken oath. When news came that the Persians had crossed the frontier, the trap was set. The Huns sent out a small detachment to draw the enemy on. As soon as the Persians spotted them, they gave chase with fury. The Hun riders wheeled around, retreating toward the hidden trench. Just as planned, they crossed safely over the narrow path and rejoined their comrades. Berosus and his men, blinded by rage, thundered after them across the plain. They never saw the danger. One after another, rider and horse plunged into the hidden pit. The first fell, then those behind, and those behind them again, until the entire host crashed down in ruin. Among the dead were Berosus himself and all his sons. Later stories claim that, at the very last moment, Berosus realized his fate. Just before he fell, they say, he pulled from his ear a great pearl-large white and of extraordinary beauty, and cast it away, lest any man wear it after him. Yet this tale may be more legend than truth. In Sutchars, it seems more likely that the pearl was simply lost as his body was crushed in the disaster. The Romans later tried to purchase the pearl from the Huns, but they could not. The treasure had vanished. Years afterward, it was said the Huns found it again and sold it to Gabades. The son Berosus had left behind the only prince to survive. Let me tell you a story. The Persians love to repeat a story about a pearl. They swore it was unlike any pearl the world had ever seen, in size and in beauty. According to their tale, the pearl rested in its oyster in the warm waters off the Persian coast. The oyster often floated near the surface, its shell slightly open, revealing the treasure inside, and nearby lurked a monstrous shark, enormous and fierce. Strangely, the shark seemed bewitched by the pearl. It never left the oyster's side. Even when hunger drove it to find food, the beast would snatch something quickly, only to return and gaze again at the gleaming jewel it loved. One day, a fisherman noticed this strange companionship. Terrified of the shark, he dared not act, but he told King Berosus of what he had seen. The king, hearing this, was overcome with desire for the pearl. He urged the fishermen to try for it, promising rewards beyond measure. The fisherman hesitated. He reminded the king, "Money is precious. Life is more precious still, but dearest of all are a man's children. For them, I might dare anything. If I succeed, I will bring you the pearl and perhaps fortune for myself. If I fail and perish, then I beg you, O king, to care for my children. That will be my reward, even after death." With those words, he set out. He waited on the shore, watching for his chance. And when the shark swam off to feed, the fisherman seized his moment. He dove, snatched the oyster, and swam hard for the beach. But the shark noticed. It came thundering through the water, closing fast. Near the shore, knowing he could not escape, the fisherman hurled the oyster onto land with all his strength. A heartbeat later, the shark struck him down. The men waiting on the beach recovered the pearl and brought it to Persia. The fisherman was lost, but his king had what he longed for. Such, the Persians say, is the tale of the great pearl. But while legends of jewels endure, history remembers what came next. In 484 AD, King Procopius met his end. His entire army was destroyed in the trap of the Ephthalate. Only a handful survived, captured or left at the mercy of their foes. The disaster left its mark. From then on, Persian law decreed, when fighting in enemy territory, never pursue a retreating foe no matter how tempting the chase. With Procopius and nearly all his sons dead, the Persians turned to his youngest Cobades, the sole survivor. He became king, and under his rule, for 2 years, the once mighty Persians were forced to pay tribute to the Ephthalate, until Cobades grew strong enough to cast off their yoke. As time passed, Cobades grew more and more autocratic. He began reshaping the government in ways that unsettled his people. Among his most shocking decrees was a new law. Persian men were to share their women communally. To the common people, this was intolerable. By 486 AD, resentment boiled over. The Persians rose in rebellion. Cobades was dragged from the throne, bound in chains, and cast into prison. The crown was then offered to Blazes, the brother of the late king Procopius. Tradition demanded it, for in Persia, no commoner could ever take the throne. Only members of the royal line, and with Cobades, deposed Blazes was the only acceptable choice. Soon after his accession, Blazes gathered the Persian nobles to debate Cobades' fate. Most agreed. They did not want to kill him, but others warned of the danger he still posed. At that moment, a powerful voice entered the council. It was Gusenastades, a man of great repute, and the commander stationed at Persia's frontier with the In his hand, he held up a small knife no longer than a man's finger, and far narrower. "Look at this knife," he said. "It is tiny, almost useless, yet right now, with this alone, I could accomplish something that even 20,000 armored men will not be able to achieve later." His meaning was clear. Kill Cobades now, before he could rise again. But the nobles refused. They would not stain Persia's honor by spilling royal blood. Instead, they consigned Cobades to a grim fate, the prison of oblivion. This was no ordinary dungeon. It was a place so feared that once a man was sent there, his very name was erased. By law, no one could speak of him again. To utter the name of a prisoner meant death. And so the prison was aptly, yet, as Armenian historians later recorded, even this terrible law did not remain unbroken forever. There was once a war that seemed as though it would never end. For 32 long years, the Persians and the Armenians clashed without truce or mercy. On the Persian side ruled King Procopius. On the Armenian side, King Arsaces, of the noble Arsacid line. The toll was heavy. Both nations bled from the endless fighting, but it was the Armenians who suffered most. And yet, despite the exhaustion, neither side dared to seek peace. The distrust between them was simply too great. Then, fortune shifted. The Persians found themselves at war with another group of barbarians. Neighbors of the Armenians saw their chance. If they could prove their goodwill, perhaps peace with Persia might finally be possible. So they sent word of their plan to Peck. Then, without warning, they struck the barbarians. Old and young alike were slaughtered. The attack was so complete that the enemy was almost wiped from the map. When Percurius heard what had happened, he was overjoyed. He saw in this deed a pledge of Armenian friendship. At once, he sent trusted envoys to King Arsaces, offering him guarantees of safety and an invitation to meet. Arsaces accepted. When he arrived, Percurius welcomed him, warmly treating him not as an enemy, but as a brother and an equal. Together, they swore solemn oaths. From that day onward, Persians and Armenians were to stand as friends and allies. Arsaces then returned to his homeland, carrying with him the promise of a new chapter between the two peoples. Not long after these events, whispers began to spread about Arsaces. Some accused him of plotting rebellion, claiming he meant to stir up sedition. Percurius believed the rumors. He summoned Arsaces once again, pretending he only wished to discuss general matters. Arsaces did not hesitate. He came willingly to the king, bringing with him several of Armenia's fiercest warriors. Among them was Byzantius's most trusted general and counselor. Byzantius was known for both bravery and sharp wisdom, a man highly respected by his peers. The moment they arrived, Percurius turned on them. He lashed out with accusations and insults, charging that Arsaces and Byzantius had broken their sworn compact and already set their minds on secession. Arsaces and Byzantius denied it fiercely. They swore repeatedly that no such plan had ever been conceived. At first, Percurius held them under guard in disgrace, but soon he sought the counsel of the Magi. What was to be done with these men? The Magi ruled it unjust to condemn those who denied their guilt without proof. Instead, they offered the king a cunning trick one that would force Arsaces to reveal his true thoughts. They instructed Percurius to cover the floor of the royal tent with two kinds of soil, one half from Persia, the other from Armenia. When this was done, the Magi performed their rites, binding the tent under a spell. They told the king to walk there with Arsaces, questioning him about his loyalty, while they stood as witnesses. And so it began. Percurius summoned Arsaces and walked with him across the tent, reproaching him for breaking his oath and troubling both Persians and Armenians with unrest. While they stepped upon the Persian soil, Arsaces swore his loyalty. He denied every charge, invoking dreadful oaths to prove his faithfulness. But the moment his feet touched the Armenian earth, something strange occurred. As if compelled by an unseen force, Arsaces' tone changed. Suddenly, he spoke not as a servant, but as a defiant prince. He threatened Percurius and the Persians, vowing he would one day take vengeance when he regained his freedom. The pattern repeated. On Persian ground, Arsaces pleaded and explained. On Armenian ground, he raged and threatened. Again and again, his words betrayed him, shifting with every step. In this way, all his secrets were laid bare before the Magi. At last, the Magi passed judgment. Arsaces, they declared, had broken the treaty and his sworn oaths. Percurius carried out the sentence. Byzantius met a cruel fate. It was fledged, his skin fashioned into a bag, stuffed with chaff, and hung from a tall tree. As for Arsaces, Percurius could not bring himself to spill royal blood. Instead, he consigned him to a darker punishment. Arsaces was cast into the prison of Obliviana, place where memory itself was meant to fade. Some years later, the Persians went to war against a barbarian tribe. Among their ranks was an Armenian warrior. He had once been close to Arsaces, and had followed him when he was taken into Persian lands. In this campaign, the Armenian distinguished himself. He fought bravely, and Percurius himself noted that his efforts were the decisive factor in the Persian victory. Pleased, the king promised him a reward. Percurius declared that whatever the man asked for, he would not be refused. The request was simple, yet startling. The Armenian asked for just one thing: to pay homage to Arsaces, his old companion, for a single day. The demand troubled Percurius. To grant it meant breaking an ancient law that forbade visitors to those imprisoned in the dreaded prison of oblivion. Yet the king had given his word, and so, reluctantly, he agreed. By the king's order, the Armenian was allowed into the prison. When he saw Arsaces, the two men embraced tightly. Their voices rose in lament. They wept over the cruel fate that had befallen them, clinging to each other so long it was hard to part. At last, their grief soft, the Armenian washed and dressed Arsaces, adorning him as befitted a king. He placed the royal robe upon him and set him upon a bed of rushes. In that prison chamber, Arsaces became king once more. A banquet was held, wine was poured, and stories were shared, just as in the days of his reign. Arsaces laughed, listened, and spoke with joy. The company lingered until nightfall, reluctant to let the hours slip away. At length, they parted, though unwillingly, and Arsaces' heart was full. It is said that he declared that this single day had been the sweetest of his life. Having tasted it, and reunited with the friend he had long missed, he would not suffer life's miseries any longer. With those words, Arsaces took a knife he had secretly taken during the feast, and there, in the prison of oblivion, he ended his own life. Thus ends the tale of Arsaces. As told in the Armenian histories, it was for him, and only for him, that the ancient law of the prison was once broken. While Kabage was locked away in prison, he was not entirely abandoned. His wife, devoted and steadfast, visited him often. She brought him food, comfort, and a reminder of the world beyond those walls. But her presence did not go unnoticed. The prison keeper, struck by her beauty, began to make advances toward her. When Kabadz learned of this, he did something unexpected. He urged his wife to yield to the man's desires. It was not an easy request, but it was a calculated one. The plan worked. The keeper, now enthralled with her, allowed her free access to her husband. She could come and go without interference, a privilege almost unheard of in such a place. Outside the prison, Kabades had an ally. A Persian noble named Siosis, his loyal friend, lingered nearby. He watched for any chance to aid in Kabad's escape. Through the wife, Siosis sent word. Horses and men were waiting, not far from the prison, ready when the moment came. That moment arrived one evening as night was falling. Kabades convinced his wife to trade garments with him. He put on her clothes, while she dressed in his. Then, seated in his place, she posed as the prisoner, disguised. Kabades walked past the guards. They saw only the woman they believed was leaving after her visit, and let him go without question. By dawn, the guards entered the cell. There they found a figure in Kabades' clothes. They assumed it was still him and remained convinced for several days. Long inog, for Kabades, to escape and travel far from danger. What became of the woman, once the deception was discovered, is less certain. The Persian sources disagree on her fate. Some say she suffered greatly. Others remain silent, and so, her story, unlike that of her husband's daring escape, is lost to history. Kabades, with the help of his loyal ally Siosis, managed to slip away undetected. Together, they made their way to the land of the Ephthalate Huns. The king there welcomed Kabades warmly. In fact, he gave him his own daughter in marriage. With that bond sealed, Kabades became not just a guest, but family. As his new son-in-law, the Hun king placed a formidable army under Kabades' command. With it, Kabades prepared to march back against Persia. The Persians, unwilling to face such overwhelming force, scattered in fear. When Kabades reached the territory ruled by Gusinastads, he made a bold declaration to his companions. He promised that the first Persian to come forward that day and pledge loyalty would be named Shanaranjeza, general of the frontier. But almost immediately, he regretted his words. Persian law was strict. Offices could only be granted to those entitled by birth. If the wrong man appeared first, Kabades would be forced to either break his promise or violate tradition. Fate, however, worked in his favor. The first man to step forward was Adergidon Bades, a young warrior and a relative of Gusinastads himself. He bowed before Kabades, called him Lord, and offered his service as a humble soldier. In that instant, Kabades could keep both his promise and the law. With support grown, Kabades advanced to the royal palace. He seized King Blasius, who had few defenders left. The punishment was harsh. Following the grim Persian custom, Blasius was blinded either by searing oil poured into his eyes, or by a heated iron needle driven into the pupils. Broken and helpless, he was cast into confinement, ending his 2-year reign. As for Gusanasteds, he was executed. In his place, Adurgadambades rose to the office of Chanarenges. Sioses Kabades ever fightful, Haji was elevated to an extraordinary new post. Adrastadaran Salanes, the supreme overseer of both magistrates in the army. No one had held that office before, and no one would after. Thus, Kabades secured his throne through cunning, daring, and unrelenting will. He restored order to Persia, and in matters of strategy and energy, few men in history could rival him. Not long after reclaiming his throne, Kabades found himself in debt. He owed a large sum of money to the king of the Ephthalatunes, his powerful allies. Desperate to pay it back, he turned to an unlikely source, Rome. Kabades sent word to Emperor Anastasius, asking for a loan. Anastasius considered the request carefully. He even consulted his advisors. Their answer was firm. No. Why? They argued. Should Rome strengthen the bond between two of its greatest enemies to Persians and the Huns? Better, they said, to keep that alliance as fragile as possible. The refusal stung Kabades, and in that insult, he found his excuse for war. In the year 502, he struck first. His armies poured into Armenia, moving so quickly that word of his invasion spread only after the destruction had begun. Towns were sacked, the countryside plundered. Then, in a bold move, Kabades turned south and appeared suddenly before the walls of Amida, a city in Mesopotamia. It was winter. The citizens had no garrison, no army, no preparations. After all, they had been living in peace, yet they refused to surrender. Ordinary townspeople, untrained in war, braced themselves for the siege. Against all odds, they showed remarkable courage, resisting hunger, cold, and fear as the Persian army closed in around them. Among the Syrians at this time lived a man named Jacobus. He was known for his devotion to religion and a life of extraordinary discipline. Years earlier, he had withdrawn to a place called Endelon, about a day's journey from the city of Amida, to live in solitude and prayer. The villagers there supported his retreat. They built a simple enclosure of spaced wooden stakes around him, allowing visitors to approach, see him, and speak with him. Over his head they placed a small roof, just enough to shield him from rain and snow, and there he remained, season after season, enduring scorching heat and bitter cold without complaint. His food was meager, only a few seeds, taken not daily, but at long intervals. It was during the Persian campaign that a group of Ephthalid Huns, roaming the countryside, stumbled across Jacobus. Amused or perhaps threatened by the sight of this holy man, they raised their bows to kill him. But something strange happened. The moment they pulled the strings, their hands froze. They could not release an arrow. Word of this marvel spread quickly through the camp until it reached Kabades himself. Curious, the Persian king came to see. When he witnessed it, he and his men were astonished. Kabades pleaded with Jacobus to forgive the soldiers. With a single word, Jacobus did so, and immediately their hands were freed. In awe, Kabades offered the holy man a reward. He urged him to ask for anything, promising recklessly that nothing would be denied. Many expected Jacobus to ask for riches. Instead, his request was simple, yet profound. Grant sanctuary to all fugitives who fled to him during the war. True to his word, Kabades agreed, even giving a written pledge of safety. And soon, men from all sides, soldiers, villagers, the desperate and the broken, came streaming to Jacobus, finding refuge in his presence. His name spread, and with it, the story of how one man of faith saved countless lives in the midst of war. When Kabades laid siege to the city of Amida, he brought forward heavy siege engines, great battering rams, designed to smash the walls. But the townspeople fought back with ingenuity. They hurled massive timbers across the rams, snapping their heads clean off. Again and again, Kabades pressed the attack. Yet no matter how many times the rams struck, the walls held firm. The defenses, built long before with remarkable skill, simply would not give way. Frustrated, Kabades tried a new tactic. He ordered an enormous artificial hill to be raised, higher than the city walls, so his men could rain arrows down from above. At first, it seemed a clever move, but the defenders had a plan of their own. From inside the city, they dug a tunnel beneath the mound. Quietly, steadily, they removed the earth until the inside of the hill was hollow. From the outside, though it looked perfectly solid, the Persians had no idea. Soon, Kabadz's men crowded onto the hilltop, confident they had the advantage. But under the weight of so many soldiers, the hollow mound collapsed. The earth caved in, burying nearly all of them alive. Defeated once more, Kabades prepared to abandon the siege. He ordered his troops to withdraw the next morning. From the city walls, the besieged mocked him. They laughed, jeered, and hurled insults. Some courtesans even shamelessly lifted their skirts, exposing themselves directly to the Persian king. Kabadzes, Magi, the priests and advisors, watched this shocking display. They urged him not to retreat. To them, this was no mere insult. It was an omen. They argued that the people of Omida would soon reveal all their secrets, and that the city was on the brink of falling. So, despite his losses and humiliation, Kabades delayed his retreat. The Persian army remained at Amida, unwilling to give up the siege just yet. Not long after, one of the Persians made a discovery. Near one of Amida's towers, he noticed the mouth of an old underground passage. It was poorly concealed, covered only with a few loose stones. Curious, he returned at night and tested the entrance. To his surprise, it led inside the city's walls. At daybreak, he hurried to report his find to King Kabades. That very night, Kabades himself came to the spot, bringing a handful of men and ladders. Fortune, it seemed, was on his side. The defense of the tower closest to the passage had fallen, by chance, to a group of monksmen devoted to strict religious observance. But that night, they were celebrating a festival. After prayers and ritual observances, they had feasted more heavily than usual. Food and wine left them drowsy, and by nightfall, they were in a deep, unguarded sleep. The Persians slipped in quietly, a few at a time, through the hidden passage. They climbed the tower and found the monks still asleep. One by one, they killed them all. At dawn, Kabades moved quickly. He brought his ladders to the wall near the captured tower. Soon, the townsmen guarding the adjacent tower realized what had happened. They rushed in to help, and a desperate struggle broke out. For a time, the defenders seemed to have the upper hand. They cut down many Persians who had scaled the wall, and they hurled back the men still climbing the ladders. The city was close to being saved. But Kabades would not allow retreat. Sword in hand, he charged to the ladders himself. He threatened his own men with death if they dared turn back. Terrified, the Persians pressed forward with renewed fury. Their sheer numbers overwhelmed the defenders. On the 80th day of the siege, January 11th, 503, the city of Omida finally fell. What followed was brutal. The Persians carried out a massacre, cutting down countless townspeople. The slaughter might have gone on unchecked, had it not been for one old man. A priest, frail with age, approached Kabades as he rode into the city. "It is not the act of a king," the priest declared, "to slaughter captives." Still burning with anger, Kabades replied, "And why did you choose to fight against me?" The old man answered swiftly, "It was not our choice alone. God willed that Amida fall into your hands, not by our decision, but through your valor." These words pleased Kabades. His rage cooled. He ordered the killing to stop, but he permitted the Persians to plunder the city, to enslave the survivors, and to bring him the leading citizens as captives. Thus ended the long and terrible siege of Omida. Not long after the fall of Omida, Kabades made his decision. He would not linger in the ruined city. Instead, he left behind a garrison 1,000 Persian soldiers under the command of a man named Glu. Along with them remained a handful of Amida's own citizens, condemned to serve the occupiers in their daily needs. Kabades himself marched away, leading the rest of his army and the long column of captives back toward Persia. Yet what came next revealed an unexpected side of the king. After some time, Gabads released those captives. He allowed them to return to their homes, though he staged the act carefully. He claimed they had escaped on their own, slipping away in secret. It was a gesture that preserved his pride while sparing them further suffering. Years later, when these men finally stood once again within Roman lands, they were met with honor. Emperor Anastasius praised their endurance and courage. To ease the weight of their long ordeal, he granted the city of Amida 7 years without taxes. Beyond that, he showered both the city as a whole and each survivor individually with gifts and rewards. In time, those who had endured the horrors of the siege found their wounds softened. Generosity first from a Persian king and then from a Roman emperor helped them forget, at least in part, the bitter misfortunes they had suffered. When news reached Constantinople that Amida was under siege, Emperor Anastasius responded quickly. He assembled a massive Roman army, the likes of which, some would later say, had never been gathered against Persia before or after. The command structure, however, was complicated. 4 generals shared overall leadership. There was Ariobarzus, general of the East, a man tied to the old Western imperial line through marriage. Then Celer, commander of the palace troops what the Romans called the Magister. Alongside them were Patricius from Phrygia and Hypatius, the emperor's own nephew. They were joined by other notable figures. Justinus, who would one day wear the imperial crown himself, Patricius, and his son Vitalianus, who later rebelled against Annas. Pharesmanes, a warrior from Colchis, famed for his skill, and Gothic leaders like Gedadisclus and Bessus, nobles who had chosen not to follow Theodoric to Italy. It was a glittering host of names and reputations. But here lay the first problem. This army never truly became one army. Each commander marched separately with his own division, advancing slowly, their movements delayed by poor coordination. Over the finances presided Apion, an energetic Egyptian patrician. Anastasius had even declared him partner in royal power, giving him free reign over the military treasury. By the time this force finally moved, it was too late. The Persians had already struck, plundered, and withdrawn. No Roman general dared attempt a direct siege of the Persian garrison left inside Amadite. Was too well supplied. So instead, they tried to carry the war into enemy territory. But again, they advanced divided. Cabedis quickly learned of their disunity. With his entire army, he rushed to the frontier. The Romans, unaware of the scale of the Persian presence, assumed they faced only a small detachment. Ariobarzus camped at Arzamon, 2 days' march from Constantina. Patricius and Hypatius settled near Cyphrios, not far from Amida. Celer had not yet arrived. When word reached Ariobarzus that Cabats himself was approaching with his full strength, panic struck. He abandoned his camp and fled with his men toward Constantina. The Persians seized the empty camp and its treasury, then turned against the forces of Patricius and Hypatius. Those Roman troops had just defeated a vanguard of 800 of Thalatae, and were celebrating. Believing they had won a real victory, they let discipline slip. Weapons were stacked aside. Soldiers washed meat for their meal in a nearby stream, while others bathed to escape the summer heat. The water ran muddy with their activity. Cabeds noticed this disturbed stream as he approached. To him, it was a clear sign the enemy was unprepared. He ordered an immediate charge. The Persians fell upon the Romans as they feasted, unarmed and unsuspecting. The rout was total. Some were cut down where they stood. Others tried to flee, only to be captured or slaughtered. Many, in blind panic, scrambled up a nearby hill and hurled themselves off a cliff. Virtually no one escaped. Only Patricius and Hypatius managed to slip away at the first shock of the attack. With that, Cabadus pulled back toward Perescia. Trouble had erupted at home. Hunnic raiders were pressing into his northern frontier, and a new war awaited him there. As for the Romans, the remnants of their grand army achieved little. Without a single commander-in-chief, their leaders bickered and undermined one another. Only Celer, who had arrived late, managed a brief raid across the Nympheus River into Persian territory. His men looted the countryside, but the operation was short-lived. The grand campaign ended in failure, its promise undone by disunity. After these events, Ariobarzus was called back to Byzantium by the emperor. The other Roman generals pressed on to the city of Amida. Winter was closing in, yet they laid siege to the fortress. They tried many times to storm the walls. Every attempt failed, but slowly, hunger was doing what their weapons could not. The defenders were running out of food. Here's the twist. The Romans didn't realize this. They thought the Persians inside were still strong. Meanwhile, their own soldiers were growing weary, battered by the cold, the long siege, and the fear that a Persian relief army might soon arrive. So the Romans were close to giving up, and the Persians, they played their part. Well, even though they were starving, they acted as if supplies were plentiful. They hid their desperation carefully, determined to retreat with honor, not disgrace. Finally, both sides struck a bargain. The Persians would hand over Amida for the price of 1,000 pounds of gold. The deal was sealed. The Romans paid, and the city was surrendered. The handover was carried out by the son of a Persian commander named Glones himself, however, had already met a violent end. Before the Romans had even set up camp at Amida, a local villager approached their general, Patricius. This man had often smuggled food and delicacies into the city, selling them to Glones for a high price. But now he came with an offer. Deliver Glones and 200 Persian soldiers into Roman hands if he was promised a reward. Patricius agreed. The villager then put on an act. He tore his clothes, pulled his hair, and entered Amida, looking like a man who had just suffered abuse. Standing before Glones, he told the story. Roman soldiers had caught him on the road, beaten him mercilessly, and stolen all the food he was bringing. He warned Glones that small groups of Romans were roaming the countryside, and urged him to strike back. Glones believed him. He asked, how many soldiers would be enough? The villager suggested 50, perhaps 100, to be safe. 200, even better. Glones chose 200 horsemen and prepared to ride. But the villager insisted he scout ahead first. With Glones' blessing, he went out, found Patricius, and revealed everything. Together, they set the trap. 1,000 Roman soldiers hid in ambush near a village called Thylasemon, just 40 stades from Amida. When Glones and his men rode out, the villager led them straight into the trap. At the right moment, the Romans sprang from hiding. The Persians were stunned. They could not retreat. Romans were behind them. They could not flee. This was enemy territory, outnumbered and surrounded. They fought as best they could, but the Romans crushed them. Glones and all his men were slain. When Glones' son heard the news, grief turned to fury. In his rage, he set fire to the sanctuary of Simeon, where his father had once lodged. But aside from that one act, neither he, nor King Kabad, nor any Persian commander ordered the destruction of Amida's buildings. And so, in the year 504, the Romans regained Amida through valor and battle, but by paying gold. 2 years had passed since the Persians had first captured the city. Once inside, the truth became clear. The Persians had been on the brink of starvation. The Romans discovered only 7 days' worth of grain left, despite Glones and his son rationing food more strictly than their men would have liked. The Romans inside the city had received nothing. In desperation, they ate unclean foods, then worse, until some even drank one another's blood. When the Roman generals learned of this, they realized how badly they had been deceived. They scolded their soldiers for lacking discipline. With patins, they might have captured the Persians in the city without paying a single coin. Instead, Rome had bought back its own fortress at a heavy price in gold and in shame. 2 years later, in 506, both empires sought peace. The Persians, locked in a grinding war with the Huns, agreed to a 7-year truce with Rome. Negotiated by the Roman Solaire and the Persian Aspabetus, the treaty brought an uneasy calm, and thus ended this chapter in the long struggle between Rome and Persia. The war had begun in blood and fire. It ended, for now, in coin and compromise. The Taurus Mountains stretch across the eastern Mediterranean world, running through Cilicia past Cappadocia, Armenia, and into the lands of the so-called Byzantine. From there, the range continues on, touching Albania, Iberia, and other nations, some free, some under Persian control. This is no ordinary mountain chain. It runs for a vast distance, spreading wide and rising high, an imposing natural barrier. Yet beyond Iberia, the mountains narrow into a path, unlike any other. 450 stays a day's march or so the traveler moves through a tight, narrow passage, and at the end of that passage stands a wall of cliffs, seemingly impassable. But nature carved a way through. A small opening, like a gate cut by human hands, offers the only exit. From ancient times, it has been known as the Caspian Gates. Beyond the gates, the land changes dramatically. Wide plains stretch out, well-watered and ideal for raising horses. Here, many of the Hunnic tribes made their homes, spreading across the grasslands as far as the Meotic Lake, near today's Black Sea. For the Huns, this passage was everything. Through the Caspian Gates, they could ride directly into Persian or Roman territory. Their horses arrived fresh, their path unbroken, the journey swift. But if they tried to enter by any other mountain pass, the route was long, steep, and punishing. Their horses would be spent before the real battle even began. Alexander the Great understood this. When he marched east, he fortified the Caspian Gates and built strong defenses there. Over the centuries, control of this narrow gateway passed from hand to hand, until finally it was held by a man named Ambasus was a Han by birth, but an ally of Rome, an emperor. And when old age and illness overtook him, he sent a message to Constantinople. He offered to hand over the fortress and the Caspian Gates if the emperor would grant him money in return. But Anastasius was cautious. He did nothing without careful consideration. Supporting soldiers in such a remote place, surrounded by lands outside Roman control, seemed impractical. And so, although he thanked Ambasus for his loyalty, he declined the offer. Not long afterward, Ambasus's aide and the Persian king Cobades seized the gates for himself. Afterward, Anastasius turned to strengthening Rome's own frontier. He built a powerful new city called Daras, about 100 states from Nisibis, and only 28 from the Roman-Persian border. It was an immense fortress, a symbol of Roman might. The Persians tried to stop its construction, but they were distracted, locked in a bitter war with the Huns. When Cobades finally defeated the Huns, he turned his anger toward the Romans. He accused Anastasius of breaking an old treaty by building so close to Persian lands. Anastasius, for his part, tried to defuse the situation, mixing threats with flattery and even bribery to smooth things over. But Darasu was not the only provocation. The emperor also fortified another city in Armenia, near the frontier. The site had once been just a village, raised to the dignity of a city by Theodosius, who'd even given it his name. Anastasius surrounded it with strong new walls, turning it into another fortress. To the Persians, these cities were not simply Roman defenses. They were daggers pointing eastward, fortresses that threatened their own heartland. And once again, tension between the empires edged closer to war. It was August of the year 518. Emperor Anastasius had died, and with his passing, the Roman throne fell to Justin. He seized power, despite the many powerful relatives of Anastasius, pushing them all aside. The news unsettled the Persian king. Cobades' aid was pressing on him, and he feared what might happen when his own reign ended. He knew succession would not be smooth. By law, his eldest son, Chaoses, should inherit the throne. But Cobades disliked him. His judgment overrode both custom and nature. His second son, Zames, faced another obstacle. Though admired as a brave and capable warrior, Zames had lost an eye in battle. Among the Persians, a man with such a deformity could never rule. That left chose. He was the son Cobades loved most, born from his union with the sister of As. But there was a problem. Kebades feared they might rise against Chosroes, throwing the kingdom into turmoil after his death. So, the king devised a bold plan. He would seek Rome's help to secure his son's future. If Chosroes could be made the adopted son of Emperor Justin, his claim to the throne would be unshakable. Kebades sent envoys to Constantinople with a carefully worded letter. In it, he struck a tone of generosity and peace. "The Romans," he wrote, "have treated us unjustly. Even you know this. But I have chosen to put aside every grievance. The truest victory, after all, belongs to those who, though wronged, yield willingly to their friends. In return, I ask a favor that will bind not only us, but our peoples together. Make my son, Chosroes, my chosen heir, your adopted son." The proposal caused excitement in the Roman court. Emperor Justin was pleased. His ambitious nephew, Justinian, was even more enthusiastic, eager to seal the arrangement in writing, as Roman law required. But one man stood in the way: Procopius, the emperor's legal advisor, a man of integrity who could not be bought. As quaestor, his duty was to guard the law, and he was cautious by nature. To him, this plan was not diplomacy, it was disaster. He rose and warned the emperor in blunt words: "I do not embrace new schemes, for where innovation begins, security ends. If we agree to this adoption, we hand the Roman Empire to the Persians under a respectable disguise. They hide their ambition in the language of friendship, but their intent is clear. Chosroes would become the heir of Rome as well as Persia. Think of it. Emperor, would you choose to be remembered as the last ruler of the Romans? And you, Justinian, would you risk blocking your own path to the throne? Among all nations, Roman or barbarian, one law is universal. Sons inherit from their fathers. If you adopt this Persian prince, then you accept the consequences. You agree, in effect, to surrender Rome itself." The warning landed like a thunderclap. What Kebades hoped would bind the empires together now threatened to open a new rift between them. Procopius had spoken, and both the emperor and his nephew listened carefully. They debated what course of action should be taken. Meanwhile, the Persian king, Kebades, sent another letter to Emperor Justin. In it, he requested that reputable Roman envoys be sent to negotiate peace. He also pressed Justin to explain how the adoption of his son, Chosroes, could be carried out. Procopius, more strongly than before, warned against this Persian proposal. He argued that the Persians were not seeking friendship, but power over the Romans themselves. Still, he advised that peace should be concluded quickly. "The emperor," he said, "ought to send Rome's most distinguished men, and when Kebades asked how adoption should be done, they should answer plainly that among barbarians, sons are not adopted by document, but by arms and armor." Justin accepted this advice. He dismissed the Persian envoys, promising to send Rome's noblest men soon, who would settle both the peace and the matter of show. He sent a letter to Kebades with the same assurance. The Romans chose two prominent envoys. One was Hypatius, nephew of the late emperor Annas, a patrician and general of the East. The other was Rufinus, son of Silvanus, well known among the patricians and personally acquainted with Kebades. From the Persians came two powerful men, whose title was Adrastodaran Silanes, and Mebades, a high-ranking official. The two delegations met at the border between Roman and Persian lands. There, they opened negotiations. Chosroes himself had marched to the river Tigris, only 2 days from Nisibis, ready to journey to Byzantium if peace was secured. Talks dragged on. Ceaușescu raised the question of Lazy Canon earlier as Colchis. He claimed it had long belonged to Persia, and that the Romans had unjustly seized it. The Romans, indignant, refused to yield. When they insisted again that Chosroes must be adopted as a barbarian, not a Roman, the Persians were outraged. The talks collapsed. Each side departed in anger, and Chosroes returned to his father, humiliated and thirsting for revenge. What followed was darker still. Mebades began to poison Kebades' mind against Ceaușescu. He accused Ceaușescu of deliberately raising the issue of Lazica, though he had no orders to do so. He claimed Ceausus had quarreled with Hypatius, and had even tried to prevent peace and adoption altogether. Other enemies joined the attack, and soon Ceausus was called to trial. The Persian council convened, but not in fairness. Envy guided their judgment more than law. Ceausus had powerful enemies. His office was new, unfamiliar, and he was incorruptible, strict in justice, but also unbearably arrogant. Even among Persians who were no strangers to pride, Ceausus was infamous. His accusers painted him as unfit for Persian tradition. They charged that he worshipped foreign gods, and that, when his wife died, he had buried her an act forbidden under Persian law, which demanded that the dead not be hidden in the earth. The verdict was death. Chabeds expressed sorrow, but made no move to save him. He claimed he could not overturn Persian law, even though Ceausus had once saved both his life and his throne. And so, Ceausus was executed. With him perished the office he held. No man was ever again given the title Adrastadarin Seleni. The Romans faced turmoil as well. Rufinus slandered Hypatius before the emperor, who stripped Hypatius of office. Several of his associates were tortured cruelly, though nothing came of it, for the charges were false. Beyond this humiliation, however, Hypatius was spared. Not long after, Chabades prepared for another invasion into Roman territory, but an obstacle soon arose, one that completely derailed his plans. The Iberians, people living near the Caspian Gates in Asia, found themselves at the center of the conflict. To their west lay Lazica. To their east, the Persians. The Iberians were Christians, and, in fact, they held to their faith with remarkable devotion, perhaps more closely than any other people known to the Romans. Yet they had long been subjects of the Persian king, and Chabades demanded that they abandon their Christian rites and adopt Persian religious customs. One order was especially harsh. Never again were they to bury their dead. Instead, the bodies were to be left for birds and dogs. King Gorgianes of Iberia refused. Instead, he turned to Emperor Justin for protection. He asked for a pledge that the Romans would never abandon his people to Persia. Justin eagerly agreed. To prove his commitment, has sent Probus, nephew of the late Emperor Anastasius, with a great sum of money. His mission was to hire Hunnic mercenaries from the city of Bosporus and send them to aid the Iberians. Now, Bosporus lay by the sea. On the left, as one sails into the Black Sea, it stood some 20 days' journey from Cherson, the edge of Roman territory. Between them stretched the lands of the Huns. Bosporus had once been independent, but had recently submitted itself to Roman rule. Probus, however, failed in his task and returned without raising an army. Justin then sent another commander, Peter, this time with a smaller force of Huns. Their orders were to march into Lazica and defend King Gorgianes. Chabades, in turn, dispatched a large Persian army under a commander named Bose, who bore the title Virises. The clash was inevitable, but Gorgianes and his Iberians were far too weak. Roman help was scant. Faced with overwhelming force, Gorgianes fled with his nobles, his wife and children, and his brother Speranius, the eldest among them. They made their way into the rugged mountains of Lazica. There, among the harsh terrain, they tried to resist. The Persians pursued but found little success. The land itself became a weapon. The rough ground, more than any sword or shield, held the enemy at bay. After these events, the Iberians themselves came to Byzantium. Their presence made the conflict impossible for the emperor to ignore. Justin summoned his commander Petros, and from that point forward, he demanded that the Romans defend Lazica Venif. The Lazi themselves were reluctant. To enforce this, he sent an army under the command of Irenaeus. Now, Lazica had two important fortresses. They stood right at the frontier, on the road leading in from Iberia. Traditionally, the Lazi themselves had guarded these strongholds, though at great personal cost. The land there was harsh and unyielding. No corn, no wine, not even basic supplies could be produced in that rocky terrain. Worse still, the narrow mountain paths made it almost impossible to bring in food from elsewhere unless it was carried on the backs of men. The Lazi had managed by living off a coarse type of millet that grew locally, a grain they were long accustomed to. But when the emperor stepped in, he ordered the native garrisons removed. In their place, Roman soldiers were stationed to hold the forts. At first, the Lazis struggled to feed these foreign troops. They hauled in provisions by hand, but the task was nearly impossible. Eventually, exhausted, they stopped altogether. With the forts left abandoned, the Persians moved in without effort. Lasica was lost. Meanwhile, the Romans struck back elsewhere. Under the leadership of two young Commandercitas and Belisarius, launched raids into Persian Armenia. These were bold men, hardly more than youths, both still wearing their first beards. At the time, they served as bodyguards to the general Justinian, the man who, not long after, would share the empire with his uncle Justin. In their raids, citizen Belisarius devastated the countryside and carried off thousands of Armenian captives. But fortune quickly shifted. On a second expedition into Armenia, their forces were ambushed. Persian generals Narses and Narration confronted them in battle and gained the upper hand. Ironically, not long afterward, both of these men would defect to Rome and later march with Belisarius on the great campaign to Italy. But in this moment, they stood as enemies and they prevailed. At the same time, another Roman army advanced near the great Persian city of Nice. Its commander was Libelaris of Thrace. Yet, astonishingly, his men fled without even facing an enemy. No Persians came out to fight them still. They broke and ran. The humiliation was so severe that Emperor Justin stripped Libelaris of his command. In his place, he appointed Belisarius to lead the Roman troops at Daras, the empire's great eastern fortress. And it was then, in the year 527, that the historian Procopius, whose account we are following, was chosen to serve as Belisarius's advisor. In the spring of 527, the empire shifted once more. Emperor Justin had declared his nephew, Justinian, as Corla, but only a few months later, Justin died, leaving Justinian the sole master of the Roman world. One of his first commands was bold. He ordered his rising general to build a fortress at a place called Mundusroit on the Persian frontier, near the road to Nisibis. Belisarius set to work quickly. Walls rose high, laborers swarmed, and the fortress began to take shape. But the Persians would not allow it. They warned that construction must stop, and if it didn't, they would halt it themselves, not with words but with steel. Justinian doubled down. Since Belisarius's small force could not hold the site, the emperor dispatched reinforcements, led by two brothers from Thrace, Coutzes and Bos. Both were young, ambitious, and more than a little reckless. The Persians gathered in strength to destroy the project. The Romans massed to defend it. The clash was brutal. The Romans were defeated, many slaughtered, others taken prisoner. Among the captives was Coutzes himself. The Persians chained the prisoners in a cave for the rest of their lives, and then leveled the half-built fortress to the ground. This disaster marked a turning point. Justinian raised Belisarius higher, appointing him general of the East, commander of Rome's most critical frontier. With him came Hermogenes, a seasoned official, sent to help shape the army. At the same time, Justinian prepared for diplomacy as well as war, dispatching an ambassador, Rufinus, to remain on the Euphrates until peace could be negotiated. But peace was fragile. Reports soon reached Daras. The Persians were preparing a massive invasion, aiming to seize the city itself. Belisarius and Hermogenes set to work. Just outside Daras, they dug a vast defensive trench. It wasn't a simple straight line. The center was short and direct, but at each end, trenches cut sharply at right angles, then stretched forward again, forming a clever, zigzagging barrier. Behind it, they prepared to stand. By July of 530, the Persians arrived, 40,000 strong. They camped just outside the city. Their commander, man named Perozes, bore the title of Mirenzda, Supreme General. He mocked Belisarius, even sending word that he should prepare the Roman baths for him, since he planned to bathe there after his victory. The Romans numbered only 25,000. They took their positions along the trench, Baucis on the left with cavalry, supported by Pharis, the Arulian, and his 300 warriors. On the right, John, son of Nasidus, Cyril, and Marcellus, with others in reserve. Flanking units of Massagetae horsemen waited, ready to strike if either side collapsed. 4 hours. Both armies stood motionless. The Persians hesitated, unsettled by the Romans' careful formation. Then, late in the afternoon, a detachment of Persian cavalry charged Baucis and the Romans briefly gave ground, then turned suddenly and counterattacked, scattering their pursuers. The skirmish was small, but it lifted Roman spirits. What followed was stranger still. A young Persian rider galloped forward, challenging the Romans to single combat. No one moved except for a man named Andreas. He wasn't a soldier at all, but a wrestling master from Byzantium, attached to Baucis's household as a servant. Without orders, Andreas rode out. He struck the challenger square in the chest, toppled him, and finished him on the ground with a knife. The Roman army erupted in cheers. Persians furious sent another Champuna grizzled veteran, older but powerful. Once again, Andreas disobeyed orders and stepped forward. The two riders clashed, their lances splintering against armor. Both horses fell, throwing their riders to the dirt. They scrambled to their feet, but Andreas, quicker and more practiced in close combat, struck the Persian down and killed him where he knelt. The city walls shook with a roar of Roman soldiers and citizens watching from above. The Persians broke formation and pulled back to their camp at a Darkness fell, and both sides withdrew for the night. The stage was set. The next day would bring the full fury of the Battle of Daras. The next morning, 10,000 Persian reinforcements marched in from the city of Nice. Tensions at the fortress of Daras rose sharply. Belisarius and Hermogenes, the Roman commanders, sent a letter to the Persian general. Their words carried both warning and appeal. Peace, they wrote, is the greatest blessing. All men of reason agree on this. Whoever destroys it is guilty, not just before his enemies, but before his own nation. A true general seeks peace through war, not war for its own sake. Yet here you are, forcing conflict without cause, even while both kings seek negotiation. Our envoys are already near, ready to settle disputes through words, unless your invasion ruins that hope. Lead your army home before greater harm comes, lest you be held accountable by your own people for the disaster that follows. The Myrins read the message and replied with scorn. He accused the Romans of breaking promises, of swearing oaths, and then ignoring them. We have no trust in your words, he declared, and so we come with arms. From this moment, you Romans must prepare for nothing but war. Again, Belisarius and his officers rode back. They denied his charges, insisting that envoys were indeed present and negotiations were real. But if you insist on war, they told him, then let God judge between us. Our banners will carry your words and ours, so all may know who sought peace and who refused it. The Persian commander scoffed. We too march with our gods, he replied. Tomorrow they will bring us inside your walls. Have the bath and the meal ready for me within your fortifications. With that, the stage was set. Both sides prepared for battle. At sunrise the next day, the Persian general gathered his troops. He reminded them of their courage, built not on speeches, but on pride and rivalry among themselves. He mocked the Romans for hiding behind trenches, for retreating to their walls without daring to fight. Do not mistake their new discipline for true strength, he warned. They are weaker than ever. If we press them in close combat, fear will shatter their order. Meanwhile, Belisarius and Hermogenes addressed their own soldiers. They reminded them that Persians were not invincible, that in the last battle, Roman recklessness, not Persian strength, had caused defeat. Obey your officers, they urged, and you will turn the tide. The Persians count on our disorder. Let us disappoint them. Their numbers may be many, but half their ranks are peasants, armed with nothing but shields. Fight bravely, and not only will you win today, you will teach them never again to invade Roman lands. With speeches done, both sides drew up their forces. The Persians held some troops in reserve, ready to rotate fresh men into the fight. Their elite immortals stood waiting for the signal. Peroses, the Myrins, commanded the center. Pitexis took the right Berasimanus. The left. On the Roman side, a bold plan was set in motion. Faras, commander of the Aruli, proposed a hidden maneuver. He and his 300 men would climb a nearby slope, wait for the battle to begin, and then fall upon the Persian rear. Belisarius agreed. 4 hours. Neither army moved. The Persians delayed until afternoon, hoping the Romans would grow weary and hungry. Then the sky darkened with arrows. Thousands of shafts filled the air, like a cloud blotting out the sun. Many fell on both sides, but a strong wind favored the Romans, carrying Persian arrows off course. When the quivers emptied, spears came out. The fighting pressed closer. The Roman left wing faltered. Pityaxes and his Cataceni warriors surged forward, driving them back and cutting men down. But then Sunicas and Agan led their cavalry in a furious charge. At the same moment, Faras struck from the high ground. His Aruli poured arrows into the Persian rear, caught between enemies. The Cataceni panicked. The rout spread. Thousands fell where they stood. By the end, the Persian right wing was shattered. 3,000 men lay dead. Yet the battle was not over. The Mirans unleashed his reserves, sending the Immortals to reinforce the left under Baras. They struck hard, forcing the Romans opposite them into retreat. The situation grew durant till Sunica Zagan and fresh Roman troops surged forward. The fighting turned chaotic. Intiklash Sunicas pierced the standard-bearer of Berasmanas. Then, in single combat, he struck down Berasmanas himself. With their commander dead and their banner fallen, the Persian line broke. Panic spread like fire through dry grass. The Romans encircled their fleeing enemies, slaughtering thousands more. By the end, nearly 5,000 Persians lay dead. Their infantry threw down their shields, begging for mercy, but few were spared. Belisarius, however, refused to let the Romans pursue too far. He knew how quickly fortune could turn, and he would not risk victory for reckless glory. The Persians had been beaten decisively, for the first time in years. That was enough. The armies pulled back. The Persians would no longer risk pitched battle against Rome. Skirmishes continued, but never again with the same boldness. Thus ended the great clash. At Dadasrom's first clear victory over Persia in a generation. Not long after, Cabeds sent another army into Roman-controlled Armenia. This force was made up of Perse Armenians and Sunite, whose lands bordered the Alani. Alongside them came 3,000 Huns of the Saberi tribe, renowned as fierce warriors. Command of the entire army was given to a Persian general named Mu. When they were just 3 days' march from Theodosiopolis, the Persians halted. They set up camp in Perse-Armenian territory, preparing for the invasion. At that time, Armenia was defended by Dorathius, a veteran soldier known for his wisdom. Over the entire region, however, command rested with Citus. The Byzantine general, learning of the enemy's gathering, Dorotheus and Citus dispatched bodyguards to spy out the Persian camp. The men slipped in, observed the force in detail, and managed to leave. But on their return, they stumbled into a band of Huns. One of them, Tigeris, was captured. The other escaped and reported everything he had seen. Armed with this knowledge, the Roman commanders launched a surprise attack. Their sudden assault threw the Persians into chaos. Panic spread, and the enemy fled without serious resistance. The Romans cut down many and plundered the camp before retreating swiftly. But Murmeros was not finished. Rallying his army, he pressed into Roman lands and approached the city of Satala. His troops camped nearby, at a place called Oct. There, 30,000 men prepared for battle twice. The number of the Romans. Citus devised a plan. He hid 1,000 men behind the hills overlooking Satala's plain, while Dorotheus held the rest inside the city walls. The Romans knew they could not fight head-on, but they could use surprise. The next day, the Persians advanced to encircle Citus. Just then, Citus' hidden force appeared on the ridges. Summer dust rose around them, cloaking their true numbers. From below, the Persians believed a massive army was descending. Abandoning their siege, they hastily drew their forces together. This was the moment the Romans had been waiting for. Splitting into two detachments, they attacked as the Persians shifted position. Courage surged within the city. The rest of the Roman army poured out from the gates, pressing their enemy on both sides. The Persians resisted fiercely, outnumbering the Romans 2-1. They fought hard in close combat. Cavalry clashed, charging and retreating in waves. Then came a decisive moment. Florentius, a Thracian cavalryman, charged into the Persian center. Against all odds, he seized the general's standard. Though he was cut down in the attempt, his axe shattered the enemy's spirit. Seeing their standard fall, the Persians panicked. Confusion turned into retreat. They withdrew to their camp, suffering heavy losses. By the next morning, they abandoned the field entirely, returning home in defeat, humbled by a smaller Roman force. In the aftermath, Rome secured key Persian fortresses in Armenia, including Bolam and Pharyngium, latter famous for its gold mines. Around the same time, the Romans subdued the Tzani, a rugged mountain people long known for raiding their neighbors. Once wild plunderers, the Tzani were brought under Roman rule. They were even recruited into the army, converted to Christianity, and became defenders rather than marauders. The landscape itself played a role in these struggles. Traveling from Armenia into Persarmenia, the Taurus Mountains rose on the right. To the left stretched steep, snow-covered peaks where the Phasis River began its course toward Kol. It was a land of difficult passes, hidden fortresses, and constant danger. Amid these shifting powers, betrayal and allegiance changed quickly. A local named Simeon, keeper of the Pharyngium gold mine, defected to the Romans, depriving Cabes of precious revenue. Soon after, Narcissus and Narration's brothers, once loyal to Persia, crossed over to Rome, bringing with them fortresses and secrets. Even their younger brother Isaac would eventually hand over Balaam by stealth, opening its gates under cover of night. These episodes reveal more than simple battles. They show a frontier alive with deception, shifting loyalties, and the clash of empires. The Persians may have marched with greater numbers, but time and again, cunning, courage, and the element of surprise gave the Romans the edge. The Romans, for the moment, held their ground. The Persians, however, even after their defeat by Belisarius at the Battle of Deraz, refused to withdraw. They lingered, unwilling to accept the outcome. It was then that Rufinus stepped forward. He entered the presence of King Cabes and spoke plainly. "O king, I come with words from your brother. He rebukes you, and justly so, for bringing war into his land without righteous cause. A wise king, one who is not only powerful, but prudent, should seek peace. Why prolong a conflict that only breeds confusion for himself and his people? I have come here with hope that from this moment forward, both our nations might enjoy the blessings of peace." Cabes listened. Then, with measured words, he gave his reply. "Son of Silvanus, do not twist the truth. You Romans are the cause of this turmoil, and you know it. Consider the Caspian Gates. We seized them for the benefit of both empires, driving out the barbarians. Your Emperor Anastasius had the chance to purchase them, but refused, unwilling to bear the cost of maintaining a permanent garrison. So we Persians have held that burden. We have kept the barbarians at bay, protecting not only our lands but yours as well. And yet, this was not enough for Rome. You built Derisa Fortress, city despite the treaty your envoy Anatolius signed with us, a treaty that forbade such construction. Because of this, Persia now suffers the weight of two armies. One guards the Caspian Gates, shielding both empires from the Massageddon. The other stands watch against Roman aggression. When we protested, we offered you a choice. Either share the cost of defending the gates with us, or dismantle Darius. You did neither. Instead, you deepened your offense by building yet another fort at Mindu. So understand this. The Romans may have peace, or they may have war. But Persia will not lay down arms until Rome acts justly, either helping us guard the gates or dismantling the fortress at Darsweath. Cabes dismissed the ambassador, though not without a subtle hint he might be persuaded to end the war in exchange for payment. Rufinus carried these words back to Byzantium, reporting all to the emperor. Soon after, Hermogenes arrived in the capital as well. Winter gave way to spring, and so ended the 4th year of Emperor Justinian's reign. As spring opened, a new threat rose against Rome. A Persian army, 15,000 strong and entirely cavalry, crossed into Roman lands. Under the command of alongside them rode Alamandarus, son of Saxus, leading a great host of Saracens. But, the Persians did something unusual. They didn't march into Mesopotamia, their usual route. Instead, they struck at Kamajanuta, the Romans now called Euphratia. No Persian army had ever attacked from this direction before. To understand why, we need to step back and look at the lay of the land. In Armenia, not far from the city of Theodosiopolis, rises a mountain. From its slopes flow two rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. The Tigris runs swift and straight toward Omida, then down into Assyria. The Euphrates, however, takes a stranger course. At its source, it disappears beneath a vast bog, a mire so firm that people, horses, even wagons can cross it without realizing they're walking on water. Only when fire once swept the reeds and cracked the crust did the hidden river briefly reveal itself before closing again. From there, the Euphrates winds through Salicene, a region once linked to Greek myth. It was here, according to legend, that Orestes and his sister Iphigenia fled with the statue of Artemis. Mistaking the place for the land foretold in an oracle, Orestes built a city and a great temple to the goddess. Later, realizing his error, he founded another Comana in Cappadocia. That city, named from the cutting of his hero ritual of healing, came to be Chiad. Golden Comana, the myths lingered, but the river kept flowing. The Euphrates grew mightier as tributaries joined it, carrying it past Melitine, Samosata, and Hierapolis, until at last it met the Tigris in Assyria. The lands around it bore many names: Commagene, Azron, Armenia, Mesopotamia, and it was here, between the rivers, that Rome and Persia clashed most often. Years earlier, a Persian commander, the Mirans, had suffered defeat at Roman hands. When he limped home with the remnants of his army, King Kabads punished him severely, stripping him of his golden header, a badge of honor second only to the royal crown. From Tate Kabets, trusted no one with command. It was then that Alamandarus, king of the Saracens, came before him. A seasoned raider and Rome's most dangerous foe, he spoke with calm assurance. "Great king, do not despair at Miran's failure. Fortune cannot always be trusted. Victory comes not from strength alone, but from cunning. Mesopotamia and Azron are heavily fortified and full of Roman soldiers. But beyond the Euphrates, in Syria, the land lies open. There are no fortresses, no armies of note, and there stands Antioch, the jewel of the East. Wealthy, crowded, but careless. Its people think only of festivals and theater rivalries. If we strike there swiftly, we may take the city before Rome even knows we've crossed the river. Water and supplies will be no obstacle. I will guide the army myself." Cabes agreed. How could he not? Alamandarus had spent half a century ravaging Roman lands, from Egypt to Mesopotamia. His raids were sudden, devastating, and always timely. By the tens of thousands, he carried off captives, burned villages, and stripped provinces bare, then vanished before Roman armies could gather. When Corned often turned on his pursuers, scattering them in ambush and even seizing their commanders. So effective was his terror that Emperor Justinian elevated one of Rome's own Arab allies, Aretha's son of Gabalas, to the rank of king, hoping he could match Alamandra's power. But whether through ill luck or betrayal, Aretha's failed again and again. And so the Saracen king continued his plunder unchecked, long into old age, a scourge of the eastern provinces. The plan had been Alamandar's idea, and King Cabades approved. He gathered 15,000 Persian troops, placed them under the command of a skilled warrior named Azaretz, and gave Alamandaras the lead of the expedition. They crossed the Euphrates in Assyria, passed through empty country, and then suddenly poured into Roman lands. The invasion struck Commagene, a region no Persian army had ever entered before. The shock was enormous. The Romans had never expected an attack from this direction. Fear spread like wildfire. When news reached Belisarius, he hesitated for a moment, then moved quickly. He left strong garrisons in Mesopotamian cities, in case Kebade struck with another army, and marched with the rest to meet the invaders. Crossing the Euphrates in turn, his force of 20,000 men infantry, cavalry, and 2,000 Isaurians rushed forward. The cavalry commanders were veterans from Duras. The infantry were led by Justinian's guard Peter, and the Isaurians followed Longinus and Stephanatius, Rome's Arab ally Arethusa, soon joined them with his own warriors. The Romans encamped at Chalcis, only a short distance from the enemy. When Alamandrus and Azerites heard how close Belisarius had come, their confidence crumbled. Fearful of being cut off, they turned back toward the Euphrates, hugging the riverbank. Each night, the Persians camped. Each night, the Romans followed, one step behind. But Belisarius refused to force a battle. He believed the Persians' retreat was victory enough. After all, they had marched boldly into Roman territory only to withdraw without plunder or glory. Why risk everything when fortune had already handed Rome the upper hand? Yet many of his soldiers disagreed. They mocked him in whispers and in secret, calling him weak, though none dared say it openly. At last, the Persians halted opposite the city of Callinicus, preparing to march home through deserted lands. The Romans spent the night nearby, in Sura. Easter was upon them, the holiest feast of the Christian year. On its eve, they fasted, not only through the day but into the night. And now, hungry and exhausted, they demanded battle. Belisarius tried to dissuade them. He gathered his men and pleaded, "Romans, why chase unnecessary danger? Victory is ours already." The Persians came boasting, but now they retreat in fear. If we force them into battle, we risk losing what fortune has granted. Victory is not always found in blood. Sometimes it lies in suffering, no harm. Remember, God helps those in necessary dangers, not in those we create for ourselves. But his words fell on deaf ears. The soldiers jeered him openly, calling him coward, destroyer of their courage. Even some officers joined in the insults. Belisarius, stunned by their defiance, he declared he had mistaken their spirit before, but now, seeing their eagerness, he would lead them into battle. The armies arrayed themselves. Belisarius placed infantry by the river, Arethusa, and the Saracens on the right among the hills, and cavalry in the center under his own command. Opposite his Arethusa formed the Persians on his right, the Saracens on his left. The battle began with arrows darkening the sky. The Persians loosed shafts in rapid volleys swift, numerous, but weak. Roman bows were slower, heavier, and deadly. Where Persian arrows splintered on shields and helmets, Roman arrows punched through armor, striking down men with brutal force. For hours, neither side gained the advantage. Then, the Persians shifted their weight, driving against the Roman right. Arethusa's Saracens, panicked or treacherous, broke formation and fled without a fight. The Persians burst through, circling into the rear of Roman cavalry. The Romans, weary from fasting and long marching, began to falter. Many fled toward islands in the Euphrates, yet some stood firm. One, Ascon, fought with astonishing bravery, cutting down Persian nobles until he was hacked apart, remembered forever by friend and foe alike. With him, 800 others perished where they stood. Almost all the Isaurians died. 2 farmers turned soldiers, brave in spirit but inexperienced in war. They had once mocked Belisarius for caution. Now, facing death, they could not lift their weapons. Belisarius held the line as long as Ascan stood. When the hero fell, he too retreated, regrouping with the infantry under Peter. On foot, they fought on, shields locked, back to the river. Persian cavalry charged again and again, but Roman discipline held. Horses reared at the wall of shields. Time and again the Persians fell back, frustrated. As night descended, the Persians finally withdrew. Belisarius slipped away with survivors. Some on boats, others swimming to islands. The next day, vessels arrived from Callinicus to ferry the rest. The Persians, finding as many of their dead as the Romans, plundered the field and marched home. Yet triumph did not await Desarets. When he returned to Persia, King Kabaz asked, "What fortress have you taken for the king?" Desarets admitted none, claiming only victory in battle. According to Persian custom, the soldiers retrieved their weapons from baskets sealed before departure, each missing weapon marking a life lost. Too many were gone. Kabaz rebuked Desarets bitterly. Despite victory in the field, he was disgraced, stripped of honor, and remembered as unworthy. Thus ended the Battle of Callinicus, April 19th, 531, a day of courage, failure, and bitter lessons for Rome and Persia alike. At this moment in history, Emperor Justinian was searching for new ways to weaken Persia. One bold idea came to him: forge an alliance with the Ethiopians and the Homeritae. To understand why, we need to pause and look at where these peoples lived and why they mattered. The Red Sea formed a natural boundary for the Roman world. It stretched from the waters of India down to a narrow gulf near the Roman city of Alus. From there, the coastline split. To the west rose the mountains of Egypt, and to the east lay a barren land, almost entirely deserted. Sailing southward, travelers reached the island of Iota Bay, once home to a community of Jews who lived independently until Justinian's reign, when Rome brought them under imperial control. Beyond Iota Bay, the sea opened wide. Navigation was dangerous, especially at night, because of hidden shoals. Still, natural harbors dotted the coastline, offering shelter to sailors when darkness fell. The lands along this coast were occupied by various Arab tribes, known then as one group, settled in vast palm groves, had long been a powerful presence. Their ruler, Abacarabes, had formally presented these groves to Justinian as a gift. In return, the emperor appointed him as commander over the Saracens in Palestine. Abacarabes was a formidable leader, feared by friend and foe alike. Yet, despite the emperor's title of ownership, the land itself remained beyond Rome's true grasp. The palm groves lay deep in arid wilderness, a 10-day journey from habitation, and were of little real value. The so-called gift was more formality than substance, and both sides knew it. South of these groves lived other Arab tribes, the Madani, who answered to the Homeritae themselves, occupied the coastal lands farther still, across from Ethiopia. Beyond them stretched a chain of peoples, some legendary, like the so-called Maniting tribesand. Then, at last, the frontiers of India. Across the sea, directly opposite the Homeritae lay Ethiopia. Their king ruled from the city of Oxames. The voyage between the two shores took 5 days and nights under a fair wind. Unlike the northern Red Sea, this southern stretch was safe for night travel. No shoals, no hidden dangers. This, too, was part of what made the region strategically important. The Homeritae set sail from their port of Bulikas, landing in Ethiopia at the harbor of Agila. From there, it was only 20 stades to the city, and 12 days' journey inland to the royal seat at Oxames. Even the ships here reflected the unique challenges of the region. Unlike Roman vessels, they were not nailed together with iron nor sealed with pitch. Instead, the planks were bound tightly with cords. Some claim this was because magnetic rocks in the region pulled iron from ships. In truth, it was far simpler. Neither the Indians nor the Ethiopians had access to iron, and Roman law strictly forbade selling it to them on pain of death. From Oxames, the Roman frontier in Egypt lay 30 days' march away, near the city of Elephantine on the Nile. The lands between were home to powerful peoples, among them the Blimes and the Nobatae. The Blimes roamed the interior, while the Nobatae lived along the Nile's banks. Once, Rome's frontier stretched even farther south, but under Emperor Diocletian, that boundary was pulled back. He saw the truth. The region was costly to defend and yielded little in return. Diocletian struck a bargain. He convinced the Nabatea to abandon their old lands and settle along the Nile, granting them richer territory in Roman cities. In return, they were tasked with defending the frontier against the Blemies and other raiders. Rome even agreed to pay both peoples an annual tribute in gold, a practice that continued into Justinian's day. Yet, despite the payments, raids never ceased. The frontier remained restless. Diocletian had tried another approach as well. On an island near Elephantine, he built a strong fortress. Within it, he placed temples for both Romans and barbarians, hoping that shared worship would secure peace. The place was called Philae. For centuries, it became a shared holy site. The Blemies and Nabatea honored Greek gods there, alongside their own deities Isis and Osiris. The Blemies even continued their grim tradition of human sacrifice to the sun. But Justinian's vision for the frontier was different. He ordered the old sanctuaries at Philae torn down. Narcissus, a Persian-born commander who had defected to Rome, carried out the task. The priests were arrested. The sacred statues were sent to Constantinople. It was a dramatic statement. Rome would no longer compromise with the old religions of the frontier. And with that, we return to Justinian's strategy. By seeking allies among the Ethiopians and the Homarite, he hoped to open a new front against Persia, one that stretched across seas and deserts, linking the Red Sea to the great struggles of empire. Around the time of Justinian's wars, events were unfolding far to the south, across the Red Sea. In Ethiopia, the throne was held by King Hel. He was a devout Christian, fiercely loyal to the faith. Across the water, in the land of the Homarite, Christians were suffering. They were being persecuted and oppressed, many at the hands of Jews, and others by those who still clung to the old pagan beliefs. The Romans, called Hellestius, decided to act. He gathered a fleet and an army, sailed across the sea, and struck at the Homarite. In a decisive battle, he killed their king and many of his followers. Then he installed a new ruler in their place, Acastician, from among the Homarite themselves. Euthymiphus ruled as king but was bound by tribute to Ethiopia. With that, Hellestius returned home, but not everyone in his army went back. Many of the slaves and desperate men who had joined the campaign stayed behind. The land of the Homarite was fertile, rich, and tempting. Before long, these men rose in rebellion. They imprisoned King Euthymiphus in a fortress and placed another man on the throne. Abramus was a Christian, but also a former slave of a Roman merchant from the city of Aglis. To Hellestius, this was intolerable. He sent a new army, 3,000 men, under the command of his own kinsman. But once the troops reached the Homarite, they betrayed him. Secretly, they made terms with Abramus. When battle came, they turned on their commander, killed him, and joined the rebel side. Hellestius, furious, sent yet another army, but this force was crushed in battle. After that, the king of Ethiopia no longer dared to intervene. And when Hellestius died, Abramus secured his position by agreeing to pay tribute to the next Ethiopian ruler. In this way, Abramus stabilized his reign. It was during the joint rule of Hellestius in Ethiopia and Euthymiphus in Homarite lands that Emperor Justinian made his move. He sent an ambassador, Julianus, with a bold proposal. Because the two kingdoms shared the Christian faith, Justinian wanted them to join Rome in its struggle against Persia. The plan was twofold. First, the Ethiopians would take over the silk trade. Instead of Persian merchants buying silk directly from India and selling it to the Romans at a profit, Ethiopia would intercept the trade. They would buy the silk themselves, sell it to Rome, enrich their own coffers, and cut Persia out of the market. Second, the Homarite would lead a military campaign. They were to rally the Madani tribes under a warrior named Caius. Was an exiled fighter of noble rank, famous for his skill, but he had fled after killing a relative of Euthymiphus and was living in the wilderness. Justinian's vision was that Caius and the Homarite, with their Arab allies, would march through the desert and strike directly into Persian lands. On paper, the plan was impressive. In practice, it collapsed. The Ethiopians couldn't secure the silk trade. Persian merchants already controlled the Indian ports, buying cargoes the moment ships arrived. As for the Homeratai, they faced a desert that was vast and barren. Crossing it was a monumental task, and beyond it lay the Persians, warriors far stronger than they. In the end, neither promise was kept. Abrames, once he was firmly on the throne, continued to make assurances to Justinian. Time and again, he vowed to invade Persia, but he only ever set out once and quickly turned back. And so, despite Justinian's ambitions, the alliance with Ethiopia and the Homeritae never bore fruit. Rome gained no new allies against Persia, and the grand strategy dissolved into words and empty promises. The battle on the Euphrates had barely ended when Hermogenes, the Roman ambassador, rode out to meet King Cabades of Persia. His mission was peace, but Cabades was still burning with anger against the Romans. The talks went nowhere, and Hermogenes returned empty-handed. Meanwhile, the emperor recalled his trusted general Belisarius to Byzantium. Belisarius was removed from his command in the east, so that he could lead a new campaign against the Vandals. In his place, another commander, Citus, was sent eastward to protect the frontier. But almost at once, the Persians struck again. A massive army under Chanaranges, Aspibides, and Mermeros crossed into Mesopotamia, with no Roman force daring to challenge them in open battle. The Persians laid siege to the city of Martyropolis. Inside the walls were 2 Roman commanders, Bauses and Besses, leading the garrison. Martyropolis stood in the region of Cephanine, north of Amida, perched on the river Nymphiista, very line that separated Roman land from Persian. The Persians pressed their assault. At first, the defenders fought bravely, but the city was in dire straits. Its walls were vulnerable, its provisions scarce, and it lacked the engines of war that might have made a difference. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time. Not far away, Citus and the Roman field army set up camp at Ataches, barely 100 stades from the besieged city. Yet they dared not march closer. They waited, anxious, with Hermogenes once again among them as ambassador. At this critical moment, spies entered the story. Both Romans and Persians had long maintained networks of men paid to slip into enemy lands, gather intelligence, and return with news. Some were loyal. Others betrayed their masters. One such Persian spy defected to the Romans. He came before Emperor Justinian himself and revealed a startling plan. The Masagetanamatic warriors of the steppe were preparing to pass through Persia, join the Persians, and strike deep into Roman territory. But Justinian saw an opportunity. He rewarded the spy with gold and sent him back with a dangerous mission. Spread false news. Tell the Persian generals that the Massagetæ had been bribed by Rome and would soon march against them. The plan worked. The spy carried the story into the Persian camp, and when Chanaranges and his fellow generals heard it, panic swept through their ranks. They feared a fresh horde of Huns might fall upon them at any moment. Then came another twist of fate. King Cabades fell gravely ill. As death approached, he spoke privately with one of his closest advisors, a man named Mebed. Cabades feared that after his passing, the Persian nobles might overturn his decision about the succession. Mebad urged him to put his wishes in writing. Cabades agreed. He declared in a formal document that his son, Chosroes, should inherit the throne. Soon afterward, on September 13th, 531, Cabades died. His funeral was conducted with all due rites. But the succession was far from simple. Another prince, Chosroes, tried to seize the throne, confident that the law was on his side. Mebad blocked him, insisting that only the Persian nobility, gathered in council, could choose a king. When the nobles assembled, Mebad produced the written testament of Cabades. The weight of the dead king's will and his remembered greatness decided the matter. Chosroes was proclaimed king of Persia. Back at Martyropolis, the siege dragged on. Inside the Roman camp, Citus and Hermogenes feared the city could not hold. They sent envoys to the Persian generals, urging them to withdraw. Peace negotiations, they argued, were already in motion, and ambassadors stood ready to settle the conflict. To prove their sincerity, the Romans even offered hostages. Just then, news arrived from Persia itself. Cabades was dead, and Chosroes had taken the throne. The Persians were unsettled. Combined with the looming threat of a Hun invasion, this news made them more receptive. The Roman hostages were accepted, and the siege of Martyropolis was lifted. Soon after, the Huns did ride into Roman lands, but finding no Persian army to aid them, they made only a brief raid before returning home. And so, through deception, diplomacy, and sheer luck, the Romans survived yet another Persian invasion, at least for the moment. The negotiations for peace between Rome and Persia reached a critical stage on the banks of the Tigris River. There, for Roman ambassadors, Alexander, Thomas, and Hermogenes appeared. Before King Chosroes greeted them by releasing the hostages he had taken. The ambassadors, eager to win his favor, spoke to him with flattery words that many thought unbecoming of Roman envoys, yet their tone worked. The Persian king softened and agreed to a peace that he declared should last without end. But there was a price. Chosroes demanded 110 centenaria of gold. To put that in perspective, a single centenarium weighed 100 pounds. It was an enormous sum. Along with the payment, he insisted that Roman troops be withdrawn from the fortress city of Daras. Their commander in Mesopotamia, he said, must instead return to Constantina. As had once been the custom, there was more. Chosroes refused to return the fortresses he had seized in Lessica, though he demanded the Romans' hand back, both Pharyngium and Balam. The ambassadors hesitated. They agreed to most of the terms, but refused to surrender those fortresses without consulting Emperor Justinian. It was decided that Rufinus would return to Constantinople to seek the emperor's answer, while the others waited in Persian territory. 70 days were set aside for the mission. When Rufinus reported the terms, Justinian gave his approval. The peace could go forward. But then a rumor spread across Persia, a false one, that the emperor had flown into a rage and executed Rufinus. Chosroes was furious. Believing the story, he gathered his army and marched against Rome. It was only near night, on the road back from Constantinople, that Rufinus caught up with him. To Chosroes' surprise, the envoy was very much alive. Together, they entered the city, and the Romans began delivering the promised gold. Yet at that very moment Justinian changed his mind. He regretted giving up the strongholds of Lazica. A new letter arrived for the ambassadors. Under no circumstances were they to hand those fortresses over. The treaty collapsed. Chosroes, insulted, refused to finalize the peace. Rufinus, realizing his mistake in bringing the gold so deep into Persian lands, threw himself to the ground before the king. He begged Chosroes to send the money back with the envoys, and to delay his war plans for another time. The king relented. The Romans carried their treasure back to Daras, and the Persian army withdrew. Suspicion now fell on Rufinus. His fellow envoys accused him of double-dealing, pointing out how his ally he had persuaded Chosroes. Yet Justinian did not punish him. In fact, not long afterward, Rufinus was once again sent, this time alongside Hermogenes, to negotiate with the Persian court. This time, the talk succeeded. Both sides agreed to restore the territories they had taken during the war. The Romans would abandon their post at Daras. As for the Iberians, they were given a choice: remain in Byzantium or return to their homeland. Many chose one path, many the other. In the year 532, during the 6th year of Justinian's reign, Rome and Persia concluded what came to be known as the Endless Peace. Rome handed over Pharyngium and Balam, along with the gold. In return, the Persians surrendered their fortresses in Lazica. Prisoners were also exchanged, most notably the warrior Digaris, who would later earn renown for driving back the Huns from Roman soil. For the moment, the frontier was quiet. Two great empires, weary of bloodshed, had sealed their truce. Whether this endless peace would endure was another matter entirely. Not long after Chosroes took the throne, plots began to form against him. His own subjects, noble Persians and men of action, were growing restless. Chosroes, the son of Cobades, was known for his restless nature. He loved change, craved innovation, and seemed to live in a constant state of agitation. That energy spilled over onto his people, leaving them anxious and unsettled. Many nobles began to wonder if they might be better off under a different king. Their thoughts turned to Zames Chosroes' brother. But Zames had been barred from the throne because of a disfigured eye, a blemish that Persian law used to deny him legitimacy. Still, the nobles believed they had found a way. They could crown Zames' young son, Kabates named after his grandfather, and let Zames rule as the boy's guardian. They brought the plan to Zames. He accepted eagerly, ready to move against Chosroes. But word of the conspiracy reached the king. John was also a man of superstition. He consulted sorcerers and oracles, obsessed with prophecies that promised him imperial power. He even performed unholy rites in pagan garb, praying that the emperor's mind would remain under his influence and that he might escape harm. Yet his audacity never waned. Meanwhile, Belisarius, fresh from subjugating Italy, arrived in Byzantium to march against the Persians. Admired by all, he was a figure of hope. But John, jealous and self-serving, worked against him, trying to undermine his reputation. Antonina, Belisarius' clever wife, saw an opportunity to aid the empress. She targeted John's daughter, Euphemia, young discreet girl, adored by her father. By winning Euphemia's trust, Antonina planted the seeds of a dangerous scheme. She convinced the girl that her father could play a key role in toppling the current regime, stirring in him dreams of royal power. Euphemia eagerly relayed the plan to John, who, blinded by ambition, agreed without hesitation. Antonina delayed the meeting with John to ensure secrecy. She then departed for the east, setting the stage for John to follow under the pretense of escorting her. Justinian, informed of the plot, sent warnings and agents to stop John, but he ignored them. At midnight, John met Antonina as planned, swearing oaths and plotting rebellion, unaware that hidden soldiers were listening. When the trap was sprung, chaos erupted. John's guards accidentally struck one of the emperor's men, allowing John to escape to the city. Yet this misstep sealed his fate, leaving him vulnerable to Theodora's plans. By May 541, John had fallen from prefect to private citizen. He fled to a sanctuary, and then to the suburb of Cyzicus. Taking the garb of a presbyter, he was reluctant to abandon hopes of office and lived in wealth, enjoying comforts despite the loss of power. The Romans seethed with anger at his apparent impunity, but fate was not done with him. In Cyzicus, a local bishop named Eusebius, equally harsh and despised, was murdered by local youths. Suspicion fell on John. The Senate sent investigators. John, once a powerful prefect and patrician, was stripped, naked, beaten, and forced to recount his life's deeds. Though not proven guilty of murder, he faced worldly punishment for his past misdeeds. His remaining property was confiscated. He was placed on a ship with only a rough cloak and sent from port to port, begging for bread or coins. Eventually, he was brought to Antinous, in Egypt, where he remained under strict guard. Yet even in this humiliation, he clung to dreams of power, attempting to manipulate public accounts from afar. Thus, 10 years after his peak, John the Cappadocian finally met the consequences of his ambition, cruelty, and greed. At this time, Emperor Justinian appointed Belisarius as general of the East. Once again, he sent him to Libya, where Belisarius quickly secured control of the country, a story we will explore in detail later. News of these events reached Chosroes and the Persians. They were deeply unsettled. The peace they had made with the Romans suddenly seemed to favor their rivals far too much. Chosroes even sent envoys to Byzantium. With a mix of jest and diplomacy, he congratulated Justinian and, laughing, demanded a share of the spoils from Libya. He argued that Justinian could never have succeeded against the Vandals if the Persians had not kept peace. Justinian responded with a gift of money and soon dismissed the envoys. The political balance held for now. Meanwhile, far away in the city of Dares, trouble was brewing. A man named John, serving in a local infantry unit, conspired with a small group of soldiers to seize control of the city. He set himself up in a palace, as if it were a fortress, and each day he strengthened his grip. Had the Persians not been at peace with the Romans, this small uprising could have caused irreparable damage. On the 4th day of his brief rule, a group of soldiers decided to act. Guided by Mamas, the city's priest, and Anastasius, a prominent citizen, They marched to John's palace at high noon. Each soldier hid a small sword beneath his garments. At the courtyard gate, they encountered some of John's bodyguards. The guards were swiftly slain. Then, the soldiers moved toward the tyrant himself. But some accounts tell a more colorful story. While the soldiers hesitated, a local sausage vendor, who had joined the group, suddenly rushed in with his cleaver. He struck John unexpectedly. The blow was not fatal, and John cried out in terror. He tried to flee, but stumbled right into the hands of the waiting soldiers. They captured him and immediately set fire to the palace. The flames were meant to erase any hope of future revolts. John was taken to prison and bound, but one soldier, fearing that John might incite another uprising, killed him. With that, the threat ended, and the city of Daras was once again safe. Such was the swift rise and fall of John's tyrannous small, violent episode, yet a stark reminder of how fragile power could be in the Byzantine world.